Alrighty, so sorry for getting out the video late. I recorded one earlier, but then I realized that I wasn't recording for half of it, so this is my second attempt at it, and I already wrote everything down, so I won't be writing that stuff for this one, but I think I can explain it a little bit better than hopefully that Mr. Tran did today. So, first starting out with a little review of the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, we got two rules, right? First rule is they're motor neurons, so they're sending signals to the viscera, and they're autonomic, so they're under involuntary control. You don't think about them for them to happen. They're a two-neuron chain, so the first one is going to have a cell body in the spinal column, and then it's going to synapse with one in the peripheral nervous system, somewhere out within the body. And where that is depends on which kind or which part of the autonomic nervous system we're talking about. So we've got the sympathetic nervous, our division of the nervous system, and it is our fight or flight response. That's what it's responsible for. It originates from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal column. And then for our parasympathetic, which is our rest and digest, we've got our cranial sacral portion of our autonomic nervous system. So the cranial sacral is where it originates from in the spine. Okay, so that's just a little bit of review. The other thing I wanted to review was in the sympathetic nervous system, we've got short preganglionic fibers, because our first neuron is going to go from the cell body in the lateral horn of the spinal nerve, of the spinal column, out through the ventral root, and then to the spinal nerve, where it's going to go into the white ramus communicus, and then either the paravertebral, or it can synapse if we're going to the abdominal wall or the limbs, or we can go to the pre- or perivertebral column, and in there we can go to our abdominal viscera and pelvic viscera, so our organs within them. Okay, so and the nerve going between the para and the perivertebral columns of the spinal column is going to be this flankic nerve. Okay, so short preganglionic, they synapse in either the perivertebral or perivertebral, and they have the cell body there. They're going to meet up with that and release acetylcholine, which binds to tonic receptors, which are M2 receptors on our postganglionic neuron. That's going to send a signal down and shoot the signal to wherever the effector organ is. In our parasympathetic, we've kind of got the same deal, a little bit simpler though. We have the long preganglionic neuron, so opposite of the sympathetic division, and a short postganglionic neuron. Okay, so easy enough. It's going to synapse close to the effector organ, and on this one, just like on the sympathetic division of our nervous system, the preganglionic fibers, that is the first neuron in the chain, are both going to release acetylcholine, and they're both going to bind to nicotinic M2 receptors. Okay? So this is where things get a little bit more interesting now. Now we're going like a level deeper. So I always go from like big picture to small picture, so that's big picture. Again, the biggest thing to remember about this stuff is the rules. So like the rule of rest and digest versus fight or flight. Okay, so that can be applied to everything when we talk about these receptors. So now, once we get to that second neuron chain, once we get to the end of it, it's going to synapse with an organ, okay, wherever that may be. And what organ it is and what we want to achieve in it dictates what kind of receptor is on the effector organ. So I don't think you did a good job of saying that the second neuron in the chain is going to release a neurotransmitter that's going to bind to receptors on the effector organs, okay? So I usually start out with parasympathetic because it seems to be a little bit easier. So the parasympathetic we've got in the second neuron, they are all going to release acetylcholine. So they also do that for the preganglionic nerve and the postganglionic nerve. So easier because they only have dealing with one neurotransmitter, okay? And they are called muscarinic receptors, though, on the host or effector organ, because they are a little bit different than the nicotinic receptors. These got named such because they were found to be stimulated by muscarine, which is from a mushroom, okay? So there's multiple different types of muscarine receptors, just like there's two different types, N2, which was our postganglionic receptor, and we had N1, which is our somatic motor end plate receptor. We had two different ones there, so they were specific to each system you're dealing with, voluntary versus involuntary. This one is going to be specific for the effector organs, okay? So muscarinic is the one that's going to be on the effector organ, okay? So our first receptor type is the M1 receptor. So this is just a subtype of muscarinic receptor. It's still going to be activated by acetylcholine. It is going to be excitatory. So excitatory means basically that it's going to stimulate something to do something, okay? So you got excitatory or inhibitory, and you'll kind of see as we go along what that all fits into. So M1, muscarinic 1 receptors are on glands. So some examples of some glands would be like your salivary glands. In your stomach, you have cells that secrete the acid, so hydrochloric acid in your stomach. And then like the mucus within your nasal passages are all stimulated by this receptor, the M1 receptor, okay? And they're also in the CNS. So the way I remember this, what seems to work best for me is that I always remember that it's excitatory, so it's stimulating something to do something. So it's, in this case, it's stimulating a gland to do something, to release something. But it's also in the CNS, and I always think, what's the most important thing in your body? What's getting us through all these exams? Or going to be, anyway. CNS, it's going to be your brain, okay? Your brain is the one that's getting you through all this stuff. So it's going to be in the CNS and then in your glands, okay? And the way I always remember that is because, well, my brain comes first, but my stomach usually comes second because I'm hungry all the time, okay? And then we've got our M2 receptor. Okay, the M2 receptor is also just another muscarinic receptor, because it binds acetylcholine from that second neuron in the chain. These are on the heart. These are specific to the heart. So this one's easy to remember, okay? And the way I remember it is because the first thing that's most important in your body is your brain. The second most important thing, can't really live without it, is your heart, okay? So M2 second because it's the most second important thing in your body, okay? If you don't have a brain, you're not going to get anywhere. If you don't have a heart, then you're really out of luck, okay? So that's how I remember that. So this is going to be an inhibitory receptor. So inhibitory means it's going to tell something to slow down or stop, okay? So just like I said, muscarinic M1 is excitatory. This one is the opposite, it's inhibitory. So this one is in the heart, and it's going to, since we're dealing with the parasympathetic, this is what I kind of love about this stuff, is that it's rest and digest. So when you're at rest, do you want your heart going a million miles a minute? No way. You want it to slow down, okay? So it's going to bind to these M2 receptors, the acetylcholine is, and it's going to decrease your heart rate and also your contractility, which is a fancy way of saying it's going to make the heart beat less hard, okay? So it's not going to push out as much blood with each beat, and it's just not going to beat as hard, is what kind of the simplest way to put it. It's going to do this via a couple different ways. One is it's going to hyperpolarize the cells. So we knew that our primary intracellular ion was potassium. So it's going to increase potassium in the heart. So that way it's going to hyperpolarize the cell in each of the cardiac myocytes. So that way they have less of a chance of actually being able to produce an action potential. Because the cardiac myocytes that we're going to learn have, a lot of them have the ability to produce their own action potentials. Okay. So the other way it does this is it decreases this concentration of calcium within the cardiac myocytes. So in cardiac muscle and pretty much all muscle, you need calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. In this case, in the heart, it's called something a little bit different, but we'll get there. And when it does that, it allows the fibers to contract. So we need calcium. So this decreases calcium, okay? That's the mechanism behind that. The M3s are kind of what I call the catch-all receptor, okay? And also the other way I remember this is that it's an excitatory receptor, and M3 makes you pee. M3 makes you pee. M3 makes you pee. Okay? Because he gave a really good example in class, which I'm sure that nobody paid attention to, because I didn't really catch it either. I learned it in another class, so, but I did kind of pick up on when he said it, is that there is M3 receptors on the smooth muscle of your inner bladder, and the acetylcholine binding to the M3 receptor, which is specific for that smooth muscle, is going to relax it. So it's going to relax it, okay? Or yeah, okay? And then we've got it, basically the M3 receptor. Why I say it's your catch-all receptor is because it's going to synapse with a lot, or it's going to be on a lot of smooth muscle. So acetylcholine is going to bind to muscarinic M3 receptors on a lot of different smooth muscle cells. And what it's going to do there is induce contraction. So there's a bunch of places that this is in the body. Like anything that keeps us alive is basically coated with smooth muscle. So this is where you really get your rest and digest, because all your GI tract is lined with smooth muscle tissue. So when we digest in our organ, or in our alimentary canal, and we've got our small intestine and large intestine in our stomach, the smooth muscle kind of pushes things along through there so digestion can take place on the different parts of the digestive system. So we want to contract smooth muscle to keep things moving along. That's why you eat fiber, so that your smooth muscle can kind of push against something. So that's a good way to remember M3, or muscarinic 3 receptors. It's the catch-all receptor. It makes you pee. It induces smooth muscle contraction. And there's another good example of this would be in asthma. Excuse me, not allergies. Asthma. What happens is your bronchioles, which are another good site of smooth muscle within your body, have a bunch of M3 receptors on it. And when they are stimulated, they induce contraction of the muscle, of the smooth muscle tissue. So that's going to decrease the lumen diameter of the bronchiole. So it's going to make it much smaller, harder to breathe, okay? And at the same time, you've probably got some other things going on too, with some M1 receptors that are going to induce some glands to secrete some mucus to make it really hard to breathe. So that's just kind of a double whammy. But as you can see, anytime you're dealing with an M3 receptor, it's going to be a smooth muscle tissue. So M4 and M5 he didn't really touch on as much. I'm going to come back to them in a little bit, but the one thing to remember about them is M4 is inhibitory, and M5 is excitatory, and then M4 is primarily going to be in the CNS, so the brain. Okay, that's what I want to hit on most right now. We'll talk about it later. Okay. Okay, with our sympathetic nervous system, this is where it really differs from the parasympathetic nervous system, is that instead of acetylcholine binding to the muscarinic receptors, which by the way, I don't think I mentioned that they're also called the cholinergic receptors because they bind acetylcholine, cholinergic, acetylcholine. This is just muscarinic, it's just a fancy word for that, or a subtype of cholinergic. We're going to bind norepinephrine. So every neuron in the second chain is going to release, or the second neuron is going to release norepinephrine that's going to bind to some type of receptor on the effector cell, and it's going to induce a change in that effector organ in the sympathetic nervous system. So primary one here, norepinephrine. So what do we got here? We've got all these different type of fancy, dumb, dorky things, okay, that are hard to remember, right? So we've got the first one is your alpha-1 receptor. So these are just Greek letters, alpha, alpha, beta, beta, okay? Alpha-1 is an excitatory receptor. So it's gonna, like I said with excitatory and M1, it's going to induce something to do something, not hold something back, okay? So, excitatory, it's going to be with smooth muscle, just like the M3 receptors. It's also gonna be a catch-all receptor, but the main place you're going to see it is in the arterioles. The arterioles are like pressure. He was talking about the main point of vascular resistance, or total peripheral resistance. That's what the heart pushes against to make your blood pressure. Okay, so when we contract these, it's just like the idea of the lumen of the bronchioles in the lungs. It's going to decrease in size, okay? And when that happens, what do we get? It makes things harder to go through, right? Just like it makes air harder to go through in the lungs, it's going to make blood harder to go through in the arteries. Thus, it's going to make your blood pressure skyrocket much higher, okay? So our alpha-2 are inhibitory, and they are found really in the pancreas, okay? So they are also kind of your glandular secretion glands. And the main one that this kind of deals with, and the classic example of this, is insulin. So when this is activated in your pancreas, it's going to basically inhibit the release of insulin from the pancreas, from the beta cells, okay? And with the decrease in insulin in your entire body, what's going to happen from that? Well, all we got to come back to, which is why I love this stuff, is fight or flight. Are we making it easier, or are we making it harder to go about fighting off or running away from something? So what do you want to do if you want to fight or flight? Well, you need to break down and get a bunch of energy available to your skeletal muscle, right? So you're going to increase glycogenolysis, and that's just a fancy term, we learned it early on, for breaking down glycogen stores in your muscles and in your liver, okay? So you carbo load and you got a bunch of glycogen stores built up, and then you can, through the inhibition of insulin from your alpha-2 receptors, you can break a bunch of it down, okay? And it's also going to decrease glycogenesis. So that's the buildup of glycogen. So it's going to inhibit that. Okay.